Zarak, so glad to have you this time here on Casual Friday version of an NO1. Uh,
Hi, hello. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Matt.
you and I have known each other a really long time. This is going to be so much fun because you have such a fun story. Like, we got to start the place we always start, right? Again, the focus of an N-on-one is telling your story. As
hmm
social psychologists, we always are encouraged to sort of look at the larger version of the every person, and we're looking for commonality. But every person is special and unique, and you are special and unique, and I want to talk about your special and unique story.
I remind myself of that every morning.
That you get up every morning, I'm good enough.
I'm good enough, I'm smart enough. Gosh darn it. I'm special and
People
unique.
like me. Uh, I like you, Xerox, so at least that's one. But I have to say, as long as we've known each other, I didn't know you when you were 7, 6, 7. I didn't know you as a kid. What was
hmm
like 7-year-old you like?
Well, in some ways, to know me now is to know me as a 7-year-old, I think, as well. Um, so the story I think that comes to mind for this is there's a picture of me when I was probably like 6 or 7, um, at the like Fisher Price little kitchen sets. So it's like me. They had like a phone, like a corded phone, So I'm like on this corded phone, and I'm holding like a little suitcase, but I was using it as a briefcase. And so you know how some kids will often have like imaginary friends. I had imaginary clients. I don't know where I like heard this concept or came up with this idea, but so I had my clients. I had two, James Bragas and Stinky Feet. These are my two clients.
Wait,
And
what was Stinky Feet in the business of?
well, I think that both of them were in the business. So as I understood business, what it was meant to be was you take pieces of paper and you put them into your suitcase. So I would take pieces of dot matrix printer paper and I would put it in my suitcase, which is my briefcase, and I would take it to some part of the house and I would drop it off. And then later that day, I would go back and I would pick up those pieces of paper and I would put them back into my briefcase and I would bring them back to my Fisher Price kitchen, and then I would make phone calls on the telephone. And little did I know that is pretty much what work is. So I think I actually had a pretty good read on it, even as a 7-year-old.
Where do you think that where was that coming from for you? Like, where was your vision of business? Like, what shaped your understanding of business?
It's a good question. I really don't know. My guess would be like, I mean, my dad had like a home office, and so I think I just sort of had some concept of like what an office is, and there's a printer there, and you have clients or something like that. So I must have heard this, picked up the term somewhere. But it wasn't really like a big, we weren't like a big, I don't know, entrepreneurial family in that sense or anything like that. So it wasn't like a businessy oriented thing.
I hear the printer was very important. Dot matrix printing, very,
The
very
printer
important,
was, yeah, yeah, exactly.
very important to you. Did you think? I mean, I hear that was part of your imaginative play. If I had said, "Hey, Zarog, what are you going to be when you grow up?" Is that what you would have said? Is I'm going to be a consultant or a business person or a
No,
guy with a
no,
briefcase?
no, I don't know what I would have said. I don't know. As a little kid, I liked reading, like playing outside, just normal little kid stuff, I think. So, no, I don't know that I really like thought about like work that much. I think I liked like diving diving and like undersea stuff as a little kid. But I don't think that I even necessarily like ne really knew what a job was. Obviously, I was like sort of pretending like I knew what a job was. So I don't think that I would have had an answer then. I think later it probably would have been more in some kind of like teacher realm, something like that.
Oh, interesting. So if I fast forward a few years and now you're in middle school and school's starting to be a little more developed, you have this idea that maybe you might want to teach.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is probably, I think a lot of people maybe this is me projecting, but I think a lot of people come to it this way, which is like you enjoy school and you're good
Mm.
at school, and so you think like, oh, well, I could just what's the version where I kind of keep doing this, where I get to keep learning stuff, but you also get to kind of teach other people. There's sort of this like inherent social aspect to it. You're around other people all the time. And so I think that's probably where it came from. And even actually up until college, I don't know if this is like jumping ahead, but up until college, I did think, so I was a history major in college, and it was not clear to me, nor had I really considered at all, like what the career path might be. I remember thinking like, oh, well, maybe I'll be just like a history professor, because I loved reading, reading history and writing, and doing little lectures and talks and stuff like that when I had the opportunity. And so yeah, it wasn't until I had some like pretty good mentorship from a history professor of mine at the time. It was like, you know, I had one who was like, yeah, this is great. I'll help you do this. Here's like a directory of history programs like around the world. It was like a huge phone book. Like skim through this phone book and highlight whoever is interesting to you, like a program or an academic, and I will help introduce and sort of broker this, whatever, which is very generous. I don't think I even necessarily realized how generous it might have been at the time. And it was useful because I went through it and was like, oh, I would highlight this entire book, like
Oh.
I'm interested in all this stuff. And so it was kind of a little bit of a signal. It's like you can't even really pick like I mean, you know this well. I think the pressure when you're actually trying to become an academic is like you opt for specialization. And I was like very resistant to that. Not sort of, emotionally resistant, but it was hard for me to pick something because I found so many things interesting. And then simultaneously, I had another professor mentor who was very nice guy, a very smart person, a little bit like bookish. Um, and we were talking about what might I do after I graduate. And he was like, you don't have to go to school. Like you can do whatever you want. I mean, there's plenty, you can always go back to school. And he's like, I was like a woodland firefighter for like 2 years before I like went and got a PhD in history and had done a bunch of other things. And I was like, oh wow, I would never have guessed that. And so that really helped kind of like I think take a little bit of like sort of pressure off a little bit of like the decision and just think like, oh yeah, you can do lots of different things.
Do you think they were responding to something? Do you think that's their generic advice? Hey, go try something else and then try a PhD program? Or do you think they were responding to something in you?
I don't know because I actually do think it is pretty good just generic advice.
I agree that it's
Um,
pretty good. Look, as a guy who dropped out of a PhD program, I think it's pretty good generic advice. But, one of the things that we sometimes hear from folks on the show is I didn't really realize these things about myself, but other people were seeing them in ways that maybe
mhm.
I wasn't able to access about myself. And since you mentioned, hey, I really liked every time I got up an opportunity to speak and teach and do those things, I could see somebody, an advisor, going like, "Hey, man, I don't know that like academia is the world for you. You
Hmm.
seem a little more socially fluent than the rest of us."
Yeah,
you know?
I mean, we definitely knew each other well enough that I would assume that the advice was somewhat tailored to me, and probably to some extent based on kind of what I was sharing a moment ago of like a pretty broad interest in doing a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely a theme we hear on the show. Not a
Yeah,
lot of
I mean, it is a
specialists
theme I
around
think
it.
a lot among behavioral scientists in general, right? It's like folks are tend to be very curious, and tend to be very curious about a lot of different things. So.
Yeah, and have that ability to become curious about something when presented with a challenge, right? It's not
Yeah,
just that they're curious about lots of things, but it's like, and I can summon up the curiosity in order to get myself through something that might otherwise be kind of boring or might otherwise turn someone else off. I can make myself curious about anything.
Yeah, I think that is true. It's funny, like the person that I actually kind of compare it to in my life is my grandfather. One of my grandfathers was a builder, and pretty much no matter where we were, like if we're out to lunch or something like that, he'd be kind of like sitting back in the chair, and all of a sudden he'd kind of like look up at something on the ceiling, and it's like you can kind of tell like the wheels are spinning. It's like, hey, like what are you thinking about? He's like, well, I was just wondering, like, how did they join this piece here? And then and it's funny, like whenever, I mean, I kind of recognize this in myself a little bit, but also in a lot of other behavioral scientists, where like you observe somebody doing something and you have almost the exact same thought process. Like, I wonder what's going on there. Like, it could be this, but you could also do it this way, and it wasn't like I don't know. I think it's just he couldn't kind of turn it
Turn it
off.
off. Yeah. And I want to rewind slightly because I'm
Yeah, I jumped
curious.
us forward to college, so please feel free
No,
to
no, I
redirect
think it's
wherever.
fine to stay in college, but I'm curious, given that curiosity, given that sort of like I'm wondering why, how did that manifest? How did that end up in history?
Um, well, I think like at first it's, so I guess I'll just speak specifically to myself, even though I think it's probably true for others. Um, you are drawn in by like stories. So for me, it's like, oh, like it is another way. It's not as direct at an individual level as like psychology or something like that, but it is, I think, another attempt to just explain like what happened and why. And your first introduction is, at least for me, it was like, oh, this is just like I like learning about the world and what's going on in different places and what has happened and why things are the way they are. But then, so that's like I think enough to sort of draw you in at first, or at least it was for me. Uh, you then start to learn, like, oh, well, just because you read something doesn't mean that it's true, right? It's like, like I think probably that was the first time that I really kind of considered or understood that. And so that is like useful sort of training as well. Like we'll learn to be like a critical reader and a critical thinker, learn to consider things from a variety of different points of view. Um, learn to think about evidence in different types of ways. So you kind of learn like historiography and there's like sort of more almost the science of doing history stuff. Um, so it would not have been obvious to me, but in retrospect, I'm like I can kind of reconcile this a little bit where it's like, well, it is explaining like what has happened and why. And you do get sort of training in thinking about like, well, this is what someone said happened, but then who's the person saying it and what are their sort of, incentives or interpretation and why would they think that? And so, that sort of perspective taking, I think, lends itself pretty well to a lot of behavioral work.
And so that makes sense. You kind of go through, you're on this history path. Professor says, I was a wildlife ranger. Maybe you want to think about something else. You have this, all right. So now there's at least a possibility you're not just going to go into another program. Does that break the world wide open? And then you're sort of like, well, shit, if I'm not going to a program, what am I doing? Is there a natural path? Like, what happens as you sort of process your way through that?
It was pretty open-ended at first. I remember talking to somebody at the time and just kind of saying like, I just want to do like something that makes like the world a better place. And, in a probably true but very, very like, kind of critical way, they were like, that's like not specific enough. Like you really have to be more specific. Um, and so, I mean, I wasn't really considering this at all until basically like the semester I was graduating or something like that. And so I kind of narrowed it down to, well, there are three things that I'm interested in doing. Um, and those were going to grad school, going to volunteer with the Peace Corps, or volunteering with AmeriCorps, which for those who don't know is kind of like the domestic version of the Peace Corps in the US. Um, and so I kind of, thought a little bit about just like, well, which ones could I do at different times of my life? And, I ended up picking AmeriCorps. Um, but even that, not a ton of like direction around that, I would say, or intention behind it. And when I think back on, um, decisions that I've made, career decisions, or, moving from here to there, whatever, there is like, you can always like sort of project a straight line, backwards if you want to. I definitely didn't feel that way at the time. But I did have some sense of like going from the very broadest, intention of like doing something that helps other people
Mhm.
to like narrowing in almost like the vector of that, and then that getting kind of like, a little bit more and more sharply defined with each subsequent decision of, a different job or a different, school, career path or educational path. Um, with, a little bit of like a dash of, I don't know if you'd call it skepticism or just sort of excitement about the the breadth of things you could do in the world uh, at each step. So basically meaning, yeah, I have a sense of what I'm doing, and I've learned enough to be more and more specific about like where I think I can have a bigger impact and the type of impact that I want to have, the types of things I enjoy doing and not enjoying doing. But you know, always sort of open to a surprise. And there's like I like kind of trying on different, what would it be like to live here? What would it be like to do this? And so always open to the possibilities of just, letting life or the world sort of surprise you.
So you think I'm going off and doing AmeriCorps,
Yep.
right? Like I could go international, I could go domestic. It's going to be about helping people, or I could go off to grad school. You sort
Hmm.
of figure out, hey, I could go to grad school later. Like there are
Right.
other seasons of life where I could do that, where it's not as easy to do AmeriCorps or at other
And I
seasons of
think I had been kind of convinced of like, do other things before you do more school as well. I think that was probably partly why.
got it. And so as you start to think about going out of school, like talk to me about that experience of exiting and then doing something different.
It was an interesting moment of like, kind of autonomy, I guess, because not in any sort of like unsafe way or, I was never like, I don't know, living out on the streets or anything like that. But I did have like a summer where I was like, oh, I don't really know where I'm gonna live. And so I mean I had a bunch of friends and that sort of thing, but I was like I graduated, I AmeriCorps kind of works similar to just like a job application. You kind of look at their website of opportunities and you apply for stuff. And so, I'd found something. I ended up going and volunteering I did it for 2 years. The first year I was at Clemson University in South Carolina. And so even still kind of close to education stuff, but it was a different type of role. But I had like 3 months or so, 2 or 3 months before I went and was like, oh, I like don't really know what to do. So I kind of just like stayed with friends, crashed on floors and stuff for a couple months, which was, just sort of like interesting in and of itself. Like, there are a couple like times in your life, or at least there have been in mine, where you're like, oh, I just have to figure this out right now. And again, there wasn't any, I had plenty of resources and plenty of people who'd be willing to help and family who would take you in or whatever. But it was kind of like, well, do I want to do that or do I want to try to do something else? Um, so kind of baby steps to self-sufficiency or whatever. Um, so that, so I had that summer and then moved to South Carolina for a year, and I was doing basically like civic engagement programs for the university. So helping students who wanted to volunteer, like kind of find meaningful volunteer opportunities, helping with organizations in the community that needed things or would benefit from things, whether that was donation, time or resources or whatever. Um, and yeah, um it was interesting. I mean, I think one, it answered some questions for me about like would I want to work full time in a university? And the answer was no. At
And
least not in
sorry, what made it no? What made you go, oh, probably this is not.
um it was like I guess a combination of things. I was working in like a student affairs division. That was like kind of where the civic engagement stuff lived. Um and I don't know, it just sort of felt like I could see other people who were very excited about the work. They kind of loved working with, I don't know, like helping folks like kind of find I don't know, their footing at that stage. And I think maybe the juxtaposition of like the nature of my role was I was focused on like things a little bit more in the community, which was a pretty rural, and relatively like impoverished community. Um, So there was this juxtaposition of like you're kind of helping I don't know, it was like it felt like there was the alignment of resources and time just like kind of wasn't where I wanted to spend my time, I guess.
Hmm. And you're
Um,
seeing other people really enjoy it. So there's a sense that like, man, other
yes,
people are
it's
really
other
liking this
people
and
love it.
I'm
And
not.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, I did do some things that I think also at the same time helped me better understand what I did enjoy, and kind of find meaningful. So like a really sort of small version of this, but it is the story that I often tell when sometimes I'll prompt people, so like what's a project that you're most proud of, something that you've done. And the story that I often tell is from that year actually, which was so for AmeriCorps, the program that I was in, you get paid at 110% of the poverty line for wherever you live. Um, so rural South Carolina, that's pretty low. Um, and the university would kind of like um, take some of the burden off of the AmeriCorps volunteer by giving you like a meal plan,
Right.
so I could go eat in the cafeteria for free. So I was doing that, every day, and would see like a lot of food that was getting, kind of thrown away at the end of every meal. And at the same time, was meeting with leaders of like kind of local food banks or, kitchens, that sort of thing. This was would have been in like 2009, I guess. And so kind of like depth of Great Recession, and essentially they were all saying like, we've the demand for our service has never been higher, and the resources that we've had have never been lower. And so we're having a really hard time kind of even meeting just the basics of what we used to do before. And so, not it wasn't like I had this brilliant idea immediately. Probably 6 months after seeing this and talking to people, I was like, oh, I kind of put two and two together, and was like, oh, there's maybe some opportunity here. And so, I met with the director at the time of the company that sort of, was the food service company there. And, I think pretty nice to even just sort of take the meeting with me because I was kind of just like a random quasi-studenty person. Um, but, we met and pretty much immediately he was like, hey, like we get this a lot. We get this idea a lot. And, I just want to say like, we don't, like basically we have an algorithm that tells us how much to buy and prepare. And so we actually don't have any food waste. We're very minimal. I was like, oh, okay. I didn't know that. And it didn't really match up with what my experience was, but I sort of didn't think that that was going to be a particularly helpful thing to say. And
You're like, that's
so
not, I see you throwing away a lot of food, man. And
yeah, exactly. So I was like, well, what could I sort of say here that might be helpful? I was like, well, um is there any time when like the computer has made a mistake? Um, and he was like, well, it's not really a mistake, but we can't really accurately plan around the holidays because we don't know how many students are going to stay or go home.
right.
I was like, okay, well, hey, like Thanksgiving is coming up in like 3 weeks. What if we like what's the easiest version of doing this, over Thanksgiving? Because there were like some things that were clearly like either they tried it before or something and it was like didn't work. He's like, they can't come in the kitchen. They can't. I was like, okay. I was like, what if it's just what I mean, can you guys pack everything up? Can it just be somebody who comes up with a truck and we put it in and drives off? And so it was like, what's the sort of bare bones easiest thing to do? And I think I went home for Thanksgiving. I wasn't even there. And when I came back, I popped by to kind of ask like how it went. And he was like, he was like, this was amazing. It was so good for us. It was so good for all of our people. Like everyone was so excited about it. I was like very blown away by how enthusiastic he was about this because he sort of seemed like a very nice person, but kind of like ambivalent about this. And it was like extra work. But I think like I'd sort of prepped the nonprofit as well and was like, guys, please just make this as easy as possible for them. Like whatever it is that they say, like I know it might be sort of this first round might be kind of annoying or something weird might come up or whatever, but just like roll with it and then I think it will go better. Um and I think it was just like pretty easy actually. Like they already are an industrial kitchen. They already did all the stuff. So, he was like, it's so good. Like we're gonna do it every week. Like we do it weekly now. And I was like, okay, I'm not gonna bring up this like amazing algorithm that like means that you never have the
Take the
opportunity to do
yes.
this.
Don't argue with the yes.
Exactly, exactly. Um, and so I think why that story's kind of stuck with me was like one, it was a very like practical problem to solve. Like people needed food. This place had extra food. Give this food to these people that already live here. Pretty straightforward. And yet like wasn't happening, hadn't happened, seemed like it couldn't happen. And so I learned a couple things that I think were valuable. Like one was sometimes it is useful just to like ask like why not just like one more time, you know? It wasn't even like I was this persistent bother. I was just kind of like, oh really? Like, well, why not this? Yeah. Um, and then I did sort of understand and appreciate like the impacts of like making more of kind of like a system change. Like I personally wasn't drawn towards like going and volunteering at this food pantry, and like handing out food to people. Um,
Or even in the work sense, I'm going to help Matt specifically find a career path or Matt specifically find a volunteer. That's a very individual version of impact.
yeah, exactly. And I've like, there have been like a handful, I feel like truly a handful of people that I've met who sort of are skilled at doing both. Like my wife is one of these people. She's very skilled at doing both. Um, Most people, myself included, I think, kind of fall on one side or the other. Like they really like and are drawn towards and are skilled at like direct service. Or they like and are drawn to and are maybe skilled at kind of like a system level kind of change. I think it's easier to tell if you're good at the direct service or not. Um, so I was kind of clearly on that side of it. And it was sort of what informed like really the next couple of steps that I took as well. I mean, I did AmeriCorps for another year where I led like a AmeriCorps program in North Carolina and Raleigh, focused on improving financial well-being for low to moderate income households, around like saving for asset building. So like buying a first home, starting a small business, going to college. And that was my introduction to policy. It was actually my introduction to behavioral science. And so, um, all of that stuff was kind of like pointing towards more of like, can you make this system or this process work better in a way that is better for everybody? And they'll never know who you are. They'll never meet you. They'll never, um, they'll just hopefully, you know, not even really think about it and it'll just be better.
Yeah. You mentioned that this was the first time you sort of got introduced to behavioral science. Like, how did that? So, you go on this history path.
Hmm.
You're now 2 years into not going to grad school. Are you still sort of thinking like, but I'm still going to go be a history teacher at some point, or is that sort of fallen by the wayside and you're like on this AmeriCorps path?
Yeah, I think it had kind of fallen by the ways. I mean, definitely the thought of school was still there. I don't know that I was necessarily thinking of like history specifically by then. I think I'd probably recognize like, oh, that was largely a function of just like that was what I enjoyed doing and was good at the time. But even that was already like it was pretty broad. Like I was a history major, but I was basically like kind of like taking mostly like English class, like history and English literature, and then um, you got kind of like wandered into that history. I took enough classes that they were like, oh, you have a major in this now, and then I like just took enough
Congratulations,
French
you're a
French
history major.
classes that they're like, do you want to make this a second major? It's like I guess this will just be a minor. So, um, no, yeah, that was not not particularly like you know um a predetermined path or anything. And so yeah, no, by this point. Um, I don't like school was still on my mind, but it wasn't like, oh, I'm definitely going to do a history thing.
And so you're leading an AmeriCorps program around this sort of wealth improvement piece.
Yeah.
How is this is where you meet or work with behavioral scientists. Like, tell me how that comes about.
Yeah, it was so we ran this program for what are called VITA sites, volunteer income tax assistance. And there was this kind of famous stat that we would use quite frequently in our work. It was like, most folks don't have even $400 in a savings account for an emergency. Um, and at tax time, in the US, that is a time when a lot of low income households get an unexpected cash infusion if they, get a refund or if they have a tax credit or something like that. So, we would encourage people to, hey, file your taxes. You might get this money back. And so we would run these sites around the state in North Carolina. I think we had 10. And, hey, Matt, thanks for coming in. We'll file this for you. Hey, here's a check. Um, Now that you have this money, did you know that most people don't even have $400 for an emergency? And wouldn't it be a great idea for you to open up a savings account and put this check that I just handed you into that savings account? And they would say, "Thank you. It sounds like a great idea, but I'll maybe do it later." Or, "Sure, but let's just put $50 in." Um, so, I mean, sometimes, yeah, people say yes, but in general, people are like, no, I've got sort of urgent expenses, which is true for those households, right? Um, but it sort of felt like a missed opportunity, and and it was incredibly labor intensive. Like you literally are running these manned sites all over the place where people have to show up. I mean, it's like a lot of work on everybody's part, like the people filing taxes as well. So right around then, it was I learned about this project that was like a tax time savings intervention, where it's like, oh, actually, like there's there are these behavioral scientists that are testing out like pre-commitment, and instead of like we give you the check and then we ask for the money back, we say like you're likely to get a refund, and if you do, like how much will you put in, or maybe we'll even suggest it, blah blah blah. I was like, huh, like that's smart. That's interesting,
That's
like
a
I
good
hadn't.
idea. Lots of
It's
people
like,
telling me no, and these guys have a yes.
yeah, it's like I had never really thought about that before. And then simultaneously I was learning about like prize linked savings, so it's like, instead of spending money on a lottery ticket, you put $1 in your savings account. Every dollar is an entry, and what if we pull your name out, you'll you'll win a bigger cash prize. So these were things where I was like, this is like interesting, kind of innovative stuff. A lot of the things that I was exposed to, I felt like I was kind of not particularly impactful. It didn't feel like impactful. And so I kind of, had this question of like, is this just like, one person's smart idea, or is there actually like a discipline behind this? Like, can you learn this? And are there other applications of this? So that kind of combined with part of my job was like kind of it was like measurement, like program measurements, meant to be like impact evaluation, but I had no idea what I was doing. And so I measured, like things that really didn't matter at all. Like I measured things that were easier to measure and like outputs. It's like how many meetings did you have? How many people attended these meetings? How many flyers did you print off, basically.
Right.
Um, so, I was like at least savvy enough to know, like, I don't think this is really getting at what this is supposed to answer, but I don't know how to answer that. So these things all kind of coalesced around, I like this focus on helping people make better financial decisions. I like doing things at kind of like a systems level where you can try to improve things for a lot of people all at the same time. And also like a lot of people don't have like the bandwidth to navigate these things. And so, or like maybe the bandwidth or this, the acumen or the skill or whatever, nor really should they have to, right? And so these things were starting to kind of gel in my mind. So I was like, well, I want to do something kind of like in the public interest, maybe improving, finances for people. Still kind of, again, going back to this notion of like kind of narrowing in a little bit. So like not just want to do good in the world, but okay, specifically like by improving the systems that people interact with, pointed towards one of the big things that sort of just influences the satisfaction that we have in life and the opportunities that we have in life, which is sort of financial stuff. Um, and so that is kind of I was in between like a master's in public administration or a master's in public policy, and I kind of spent a little bit of time just like learning the differences between those, and visited a couple schools, and then ended up going to Duke for their public policy program.
Which, of course, also has a great tradition of behavioral science, right? It's
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Common Sense Lab and lots of people and energy around doing these things, right?
Yeah.
And so as you're experimenting with this thing, there's a little bit of nice happenstance where there's a little bit of synergistic stuff. If we look at the offshoots here, there's a alternative universe where Zarak like went off and became an academic, right?
Yep.
We didn't make that pivot. Then there's a version, you mentioned MPA versus MPP. Like there's a version of you that goes and becomes a senior administrator at AmeriCorps and runs bigger and bigger
Right.
nonprofit like sort of versions of things. You take this MPP route, like, okay, hey, we're going to get a master's public policy. We're going to start to go this version. You still want to do good. At some point, you arc over, because you do go to Booz Allen, like you do go into a for-profit career. What was that? What was that sort of fork in the road, and sort of how did that adjust to the left rather than the version
Yeah.
that goes and runs AmeriCorps or runs, you know, CFPB or whatever?
Yeah. Well, like everyone who wants to do good in the world, I went to management consulting. No, I'm
But
kidding. Um, yeah, no, it's funny. I definitely had like a kind of a preconceived notion of like, oh, what consulting would be like. And when I was in school, I worked for like an education technology company that was almost like a quasi nonprofit, just the way that they operated. And then I worked for an education nonprofit as well. And so I kind of like thought that was the track that I would sort of go down, was maybe some kind of nonprofit-y, but I was like starting to do a little bit of private sector stuff even there. And that was a good, I think, experience because, I worked with the CEO of this company who is like an incredibly, you know, uh, generous, pro-social I mean, like built the company around like how do you help more children read better, and kind of um was sometimes hard to distinguish like the the work that they would do from like the work that a nonprofit would do. Um, so that was like just I think useful to kind of see like, oh, like you can still have like a really positive impact like on this track. I was not considering consulting until like a friend of mine who had done an internship at Booz Allen, came back for the second year of school and was like, "Hey, I think that you should meet the principal, one of the principals at this firm who I worked for." And I was like pretty dismissive of this idea. I was like, "No, it's not for me." Blah.
What was what was the genesis? What about you and your circumstances and things made this colleague say, "Hey, I think you're going to have this vibe"?
I asked him that. I was like, "Why do you think that I would want to meet and he's like, because I sort of explained what I was imagining consulting to be, where it's like, oh, you're just kind of like jet setting around and you're cutthroat and blah, blah, and whatever. And he's like, it's really not what this is like, I think, like, I was like, it's like, why don't you just meet him? It's like, he's a nice guy. Like they do interesting work. It's public sector focused. It's whatever. And, so, I mean, it truly was like just kind of, I think my lack of knowledge about the space of, sort of what it could be. And so I think, those were kind of the reasons why he suggested it to me. I think like part of it was kind of, you know, um, temperament a little bit. Like, I was pretty hardworking, I guess. Like I was doing all of these things in addition to school. I think I was an RA or sorry, I was a TA, was working at this nonprofit, was working at this for-profit simultaneously, like while in school. So I think he was like, well, you clearly kind of like, can like put in the hours of doing this. Um, and it's interesting work. Like you get exposed to lots of different things. It's, like they kind of invest in your professional development because like that's sort of the nature of like what you're selling as a consultancy is like the quality of the people there. And so you kind of care that they are, high quality when you hire them, but also you want to give them lots of training, investment, whatever. So I think that was kind of what why he was thinking about it. Um, so I did met with that principal, um, a guy named Ben Margolin. Shout out to Ben Margolin. Um, and he he was like, it was a very casual conversation. Like, I brought my resume to it. I think it was like right around when we were graduating, and I learned my lesson from undergrad of like you should actually start thinking about getting a job before like 2 months before you
Before
graduate.
it happens.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and so he you know, very casual conversation. What are you interested in? What have you been doing? I talked about school. I talked about behavioral science. I talked about you know, the nature of the work that I've been doing outside of school.
And I
And
want to pause there. So at that point, you are thinking of yourself at least somewhat in the frame of, because you didn't go get a master's in behavioral science. Booz Allen isn't naturally where one goes as a behavioral
yeah,
scientist, but you are starting to think of yourself from a behavioral lens even this early on.
I was excited about, yeah. And in fact, I would have probably called myself a behavioral economist at the time. Like my entry point to the field was behavioral economics. And so it was very like nudge oriented, like that was kind of the extent of it. Like I would not have extended it in the way that I do now to be more of kind of like a broader set of disciplines. And I think even like the work that I did in school was kind of focused on like kind of the interventions you might build into like a health insurance exchange or something like that to get people to make better decisions in choosing insurance. Um, So yeah, I mean, I think I kind of positioned myself that way, but with a little bit of understanding that like nobody was actually looking for that. So I
Right.
shouldn't just say that this is what I am, like so I think it kind of if it was like interesting enough that people were like, oh, that's kind of interesting, but like we don't have a job for that. We have a job for a management consultant. Like, so can you do that? And then if you also have this, well, that's great. Do you also sing in the choir? You can sing in the choir too. So um So yeah, I mean but that felt very kind of happenstance. So when I graduated, had this conversation with Ben, had reached back out and was like, hey, like I really liked meeting him, and was like, if there's if you ever want to have a follow up or do an interview or anything, let me know. And he's like, yeah, yeah, no, we'll be in touch. And in the meantime, had gotten a couple offers from these places that I had been working at in school, which was already kind of like a relief. It was like I think if you're tracking, I have not had a job really up until this point. I mean, I had like I delivered the newspaper and was like I did gardening and stuff like that or landscaping. But um, so it's like okay, good. This is a relief. Like there are places that will offer me a job. Um, and then out of the blue, got a call from like a recruiter at Booz Allen, was just like, hey, like Ben liked me and you a while back. We want to make you an offer if you can come here. And so I was like, oh, like I thought this was gonna like I thought I was gonna have to go do more of a thing. So um so I remember like thinking about the decision at the time, and talking to a couple folks around like, which of these paths seemed like a good path to go down.
Well, especially because it's a known unknown path, right? It's going to work for something that you essentially have been doing, but now you're going to get to do it for money. And,
Yep.
there's a sort of known piece here. You've been in America where you've done these things like, and you know very little about what being a management consultant is about. So it's a very unknown, known path. How did you
Yeah.
make that decision? And why did we end up on this path and not that path?
I got what was, I think, like really good advice. It's advice that I've like given other people as well, where it wasn't just known, unknown. It was also like easy versus challenging. Like the things that were known to me felt like they would be easy. And when I first thought about it, I was like, that is appealing. Like, why would anybody want to do something hard? And I was like talking to our like career advisor at the time. And she's like, okay, like, what are you thinking? I was like, well, here are the things. She's like, well, why are you considering these other ones? And I was like, well, like they basically pay the same amount of money and it's pretty easy. She's like, it's not a good reason. She's like, that's a bad reason.
That is a bad reason.
Like,
Low inhibiting pressure is a bad reason.
yeah. She's like, it's not like you're like 65 years old and you're like easing into retirement. You're like literally getting your first job.
Yeah. I mean,
And
there's a real lesson there. Low inhibiting pressure is not itself a promoting pressure, right?
it
Like,
was totally. And it was like, um, I was not at all resistant to that message either. Like it immediately made sense to me, and I was like, "Oh, you're right." And then I kind of have almost gone the opposite direction every single time in my life. I mean, including that time, but since then too, of like, which one of these feels like it's more challenging in a way where I will like learn more and grow more and get to try new things
Yeah,
as opposed to,
it's not foolish challenge. It's not superficial challenge. It's
yeah,
not,
don't do something that's like clearly not going to work at all, right? But it's like, well, this no, there is something interesting here, and it could be like it might be challenging, but I'll probably learn a lot and grow and whatever. It's like, well, obviously do that one. I mean, I think she let me kind of come to that realization a little bit myself, but was very helpful in steering me towards that. So that was the main thing. And I think the other thought that I had at the time was a little bit around kind of like, one way, two-way door type thing. Like, you know, if in a few years I decide, oh, working at a big consulting firm is not for me and I want to go work at a nonprofit, I think that will be pretty easy to navigate. If in 5 years I'm like, actually, instead of being a data analyst at this nonprofit, I want to go work for a consulting firm, that might be a little bit of a harder trajectory to like reorient myself back towards.
yeah,
So I think that was the other thought that I had in my mind at the time.
got it. And so you get there, you don't really, you have some ideas of what it's about, but you don't really know what it's about,
Yeah,
right? You take on this hard new thing. You're there for a while. I mean, you were there, almost
yeah,
5 years. You were there a long
5 years,
time.
something like that. Yeah,
Yeah. What how did you know it was time to do the next thing? You went from there to merits. How did you know? Because you're growing, and sort
yeah,
of the nature of consulting is the longer you stay, you're incented to make progress, right? You're incented to
yeah,
sort of like
yeah,
stay
yeah,
in one place for a very long time, build lots of relationship, build a book of business, et cetera. Like that's the
yeah.
path. What made you go, hey, maybe I don't want to be on this sort of like I'm going to go become a partner at Booz Allen?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple things that um, probably played into that. So one was maybe 2 years in, I decided to like work remotely, which was very unusual at the time, like for maybe in general, but certainly at the firm. I mean, it was like 25,000 people, and I think like probably 50 worked remotely. It was still like there wasn't Zoom. Nobody was using like Skype. It was like conference calls. And it was always annoying. It was like, oh, we have to add a conference line because Rock isn't here. You can't see anything on a screen. You have to be like, what are you guys looking at? Like, um, and um, so like the circumstances just they did not do this necessarily out of the goodness of their heart. I think like I mean people did sort of advocate for me and all that stuff, but it was just like the work that I've been doing. I've been on this contract for maybe a year. They had sort of like kind of a unplanned for like turnover both on the client side and on our side. And so they wanted to kind of retain folks that were there. And they're like, hey, we just want to make sure. I was kind of getting a little bit bored on the project because it was good, but it was like pretty repetitive. And so I'd started looking at internally just other projects that I could go to and other clients I could go work with. And so I'd found something a little bit more kind of interesting, innovation kind of work with the VA. And I went to go meet with my boss and say, like my project boss, and say, hey, like I'm, gonna try to shift over to this project, which typically people are pretty supportive of. I mean, they're just kind of like, yeah, you've been great here, happy to help you do the next thing, find another person. It's like not at all uncommon. But because so many other folks had sort of shifted off, um, he's basically like,
Please
please
don't.
don't do this. Like, like, can we promote you into like the next level up and then like you lead this team? And this was another like I think useful kind of career decision moment or like kind of informing other things that I've done later. Um, I had been there not too long at this point, so 2 years, I think, and I'd been promoted, I think, every year, which was like not unheard of, but like pretty fast. And so then to get promoted again, 6 months or whatever after the last one, it sort of would have been like, oh, this is a good signal that kind of what you're describing, like this sort of path to like a senior leadership. It wasn't a super senior role, but it's just like, oh, well, that's like pretty fast, like there's a trajectory there. But then I thought about like, what actually is that job? Like, what would I be doing? It's like I will be sitting in a cubicle in Arlington, Virginia, looking at an Excel file, and then going around to other people who look at the same Excel file and saying, like, what did you put in cell C9 and should that have been in cell D9? Like I don't think I really want to do that job. Um, but maybe this is a good sort of opportunity to introduce, just something that would be more interesting in my life. So I was like, I'll stay on the project. I don't want to be like, I think you need this person here in person. So I'll stay where I'm at and the level that I'm at, the job that I'm doing, and I'll help out with whatever you need help with. But if I can do it remotely, um, and I had some other reasons too. My grandparents were had both like gotten sick kind of right at the same time, and so I was like, I'm gonna go help them out. And so the first couple months were like not glamorous. It was like kind of like working from a hospital for like a couple months. They then both recovered, got better. And I was like, well, what do I want to do now? And so I spent like, the next 2.5, 3 years, like, having a great time, like just, I would, 2 weeks at a time in different cities, kind of bouncing around, maybe 9 months in the States and 2, 3 months abroad every year, something like that. It was great. And um, I think it was actually during this time that you and I met. Yeah. I mean, I knew we had to start with me as a little baby consultant, but really, I think the story starts with me and you on a podcast together, however many years ago. I think you were the first guest on our podcast. Um, so
But you can't leave that. I mean, but I mean, certainly you're developing as a behavioral scientist there. So it's not that you use behavioral science to get the job. You thought about yourself as a behavioral economist. You are getting design in action. You are getting involved in action design. I mean, this is a
yeah,
continuing and developing path for you, largely at a place where there isn't that, right? It's not like
yeah,
Booz Allen was building their own behavioral science team.
yeah,
What made you end up in this sort of community of other behavioral scientists?
yeah. Well, that is what made me end up in that community. So I was working there. The nature of the work really kind of broke into like three broad categories. The first and the biggest in terms of time was just like program management. So I was doing like financial analysis, program management, like very kind of cut and dry management consultancy stuff, which was like, you know, dull, but like it is important. It has been helpful for me in my career to just like know how to manage a big program, know how to budget a big thing, whatever. That stuff is important and useful, depending on what you want to do. The second part was I was kind of serving as this like innovation, kind of like liaison. We had like a R&D department, and then we had our market-facing team, and I kind of was like a little bit of a go-between there. But that was also sort of like a self-designed role. That wasn't really, there was no formality to that. I kept kind of pitching like, you should have somebody like this that does this full time. And they're like, how many billable hours is that? None? Okay, well,
Cool. You're such a cost center. Fantastic.
come back to us in 6 months with your dumb idea again. Um, and then I was kind of co-leading this behavioral science community of practice. So that did lead to some interesting work. But to your point, it was like few and far between. There weren't that many, most of the work was public sector. They weren't really asking for behavioral sciencey stuff as much at the time. So it was very like niche contracts when they would come up. Um, and so, I was looking for more of like that community, like where can I continue to grow and, stay connected here, really like to practice, and that's how I was introduced to Action Design Network. So Steve Wendell had founded it, I think in 2012, maybe 2010, something like that. I joined in 2014, so I think 2012, I joined in 2014. And like immediately from the first event, I was like, oh, this is like exactly what I want to do. Like these are the exact people that
These
I
are
want to
my
meet.
people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it truly was. We talk. So I'm still a volunteer there, over 10 years later, and it comes up. The field has grown a lot. The organization has grown a lot. It has a new name now called Bescy, and we always kind of come back to like, well, what's sort of the core of what we do? And the specific initiatives, have kind of changed over the years. We'll try new things, we'll sunset stuff, we'll bring stuff back. But the core has always been like it should always feel like you're at a place where you're like, oh, like these are my people, you know? Like finally, like folks who like understand what I'm trying to do, who like speak the same language. And that should be true whether you're like kind of brand new to the field and you're just kind of learning about it, whether you know, you're working on a team, you're like you're a practitioner, but you're still kind of early career, or whether you're like, senior in the field and leading teams, like some pe people who understand kind of like what you're trying to accomplish and can help you. So was getting involved there. Um, Literally first, just like I was so excited to have found it that I was like, "What do you guys need help
What do you need
with?"
help
Like, I'll
with?
help. Yeah, I was like, "I'll do whatever you need." And they're like, "Well, can you just like pick up these chairs for us?" I was like, "Yeah, totally." So it's been the first
Got
like I
it.
don't know 5 or 10 meetings, just like picking up chairs, setting stuff up, greeting people and showing them, or like walking them from the door to the meeting room or whatever. Um, and then maybe 6 months into that or something, they were formally like kind of incorporating as a nonprofit and needed officers. And so they're like, hey, like you're around. Do you want to be like an officer here?
You warm
Um,
body.
yeah,
Congratulations.
truly. I mean, I think it was not far from that. And so served as like the secretary, I think was maybe my first role. So served as that for maybe a year or so, um, and then we started opening up additional chapters in different cities. So the first one was in Washington, D.C., and then opened one in New York and then Chicago. And so Steve, who had founded it, stepped into this kind of role as like the president of the organization, and then we had chapter presidents. So I led the DC chapter for a couple of years. So it was a great opportunity to kind of like meet other behavioral scientists, start to get a clearer picture of like what are the types of things that people actually do in these roles. Um, and even, of course, it has evolved and grown so much since then because that was like a decade ago. Um, but it was like kind of through that network that I met Charlotte Blank, who was the chief behavioral officer at Merits. We had interviewed her for our podcast, and I think actually it was like I don't know if I ever told you this, but it was like I think I think we had just published the one that we had done with you. So Eric Johnson and I co-hosted this podcast for Action Design. And I think you were like the first guest, maybe, or like a really early on guest. And we did this episode on like a chief behavioral officer, like what's it mean to be a chief behavioral officer? And so she had seen that and was like, "Oh yeah, I just saw this podcast that you did." And this was like as I was like meeting her, sort of to like apply for this job, basically. And so, anyways, thanks Matt for that.
Well, and
Um,
she did, and for those that don't know, Charlotte then became the chief behavioral officer at sort of Merits, right? Like,
yeah,
sort of we latched onto this job title, and it sort of got manifested, which was great.
yeah, exactly. And she was building out a team. Basically, they had done like they were evolving. It was pretty interesting, but it's a very old company. It was 125 years old, and um, originally started out as like a jewelry manufacturer. So they like made watches, and then in the Great Depression, nobody was buying watches anymore because nobody had any money, and so they pivoted to like a B2B business and started offering like jewelry watches as like sales incentives and as like a recognition thing. So if like you're familiar with this tradition of like, your grandfather or whatever like got a gold watch at retirement, like that was like they like kind of invented this idea and this sort of, you know, broadened this field around like incentives and performance and the psychology of this. So it's a very interesting place. And they had this kind of think tanky type center that they were evolving to be a little bit more applied. So it's still this academic research partnership component to it. But then like how can you drive these behavioral, insights and application of behavioral science like more deeply into the portfolio companies that they had. So Charlotte was like, yeah, we're looking for somebody who, can like manage a big program, but like knows corporate innovation. And, we want somebody who's a behavioral scientist. You've got this like network. Maybe you know somebody. Maybe I do know somebody,
Yeah,
Charlotte.
maybe that doesn't. And so it sounds like the fork was really, hey, I'm on this path of Booz Allen. I keep going. I can be a partner, whatever. But I'm never really going to get to burgeon as a behavioral scientist around here. I'm not going to be around behavioral scientists. The majority of our contracts are not going to. I'm going to
Yeah,
do program management largely, right?
that was definitely true. And like the sort of like work remote travel thing was so fun that like it kept this momentum for like a few additional years, I think. Otherwise, I probably would have left sooner, but it was like so much fun. And so my quality of life was just super high just because like traveling around and visiting friends and meeting new people and going to new places. And like supporting the nonprofit. Like I would often travel to a city where we were like starting a new chapter, or, host an event, that sort of thing. Um, Once again, credit to the partner who hired me there. When I got this offer from Merritt's, I talked to them and was like, "Hey, I just want to let you know I got this offer, go lead behavioral science, innovation stuff." And he was like, like the company leader in me, if I like have that hat on, like, I want to kind of keep you here and like convince you to stay, but like if I almost think of it as though I were like your big brother, like you should just go try this.
Yeah, you should
And
take this
like,
job.
yeah, like go try it. And if you don't like it, just come back. Like we'll obviously hire you.
Right.
And it was just so nice. Like it was so like it gave me such confidence, in like taking that step because I didn't know if I would like it. And so it was just like, I always felt like I had great kind of leadership. That is one thing that I've always felt very, I don't know, I've probably not emphasized that in the stories enough so far, but I've always had very, very good and thoughtful leaders that I've worked for
Mm.
at every one of these places, like folks that I've learned a lot from, who've been very like supportive and generous. And I learned like technical things, but I also just learned a lot about like how do I want to show up, myself in yeah, in leading people, but also just kind of generally in life. So, anyways, that made that sort of transition a lot easier because it was sort of like I know you really well, I know this company really well, and like I
You should give
sort
this
of
a
am
try.
gonna, like go give it a try. Yeah. Um, so yeah, so I did.
And what was it like to go from a place where, you're really the solo behavioral scientist to really being a place where there are a bunch of other behavioral scientists and you can start to sort of, I mean, how did that feel?
I love that question because it's like something that I talk to people a lot about when I'm hiring them now, where I'm like, how right now nobody understands what you're talking about, and you always have to convince them that this is worthwhile or whatever. Like, you will now be at a place where everybody already understands that, and everybody already like speaks the same language as you, and everybody like is excited about what you can do and what you can bring here and is eager to help you do that. So yeah, from like the first like 5 minutes of being in like a team meeting and just like talking about stuff, like I was like, oh man, this is,
Somewhat.
any concern that I might have had, which was probably pretty minimal by that point, was totally out the window, and was just super excited about it. Yeah. And also I, it is that was the point when I started like broadening beyond behavioral economics. So I'll
Mhm.
give a colleague of mine now, Laurel Newman, the kind of credit for this. Like when I came in, I was like very behavioral econ focused, like, well, like when you're planning an event, like think about the peak end rule, think about blah blah blah. People are loss averse, but and like still that stuff's great, still talk about that stuff, but like her background is in social psychology, and she's like, well, like think about like intrinsic motivation, think about and like the biggest part of this company was incentive design and employee engagement, and there is I gained a much greater appreciation for like the broader set of tools of behavioral science. It's probably when I started changing kind of like the language of how I talked about like myself and our team. It's like not a behavioral economics team, it's a behavioral science team, because it is a much, it's a very limited sort of tool set to just kind of pick one of these things and say, well, we just do this thing. Like, why? Right. So that was the other like big benefit, advantage, whatever you want to call it, of like being on a team of folks that had like diverse academic training and experiences and backgrounds. Um, Also just like being at a company where the guy on our team who led like the academic partnerships, his name is Russ Fry. He had been at the company for I think like 30 years or something, 35, like for a long time at that point, and like had literally like written the book on like how to design an incentive. Like there's like a manual, right? And it was almost like how a draftsman would draw, like yeah, like my other non-farming other grandfather, um, when he would draw like plans for a house or something like that, right? Just like a very like detailed, intricate, and he knew so much about about this work. So, I mean, he was on the behavioral science team. He hadn't, I don't, hadn't had, he didn't get like a, a PhD in behavioral science, but he knew all of this stuff and he knew way more than what I knew, about like how people make decisions related to incentives, related to, designing employee engagement sort of programs. And so that was like a very useful and humbling experience for me, not necessarily from him or anything like that, but like showing up in a room with a bunch of like, folks who've been doing this for a long time. And I think partly because my job was like, you're the innovation person. It's like you're supposed to kind of show up and be like this sort of smart, innovative person. Not, I learned a lot about like how to not show up, right? Um, because like I'll just describe something where I'm like, oh, well, I think you could try it this way. And like, there's actually it's like some research that shows like people react to this, this, this. And the response would be like, oh, you mean like the old up down whiz bang? Or it's like, yeah, we've been doing that since '67. Um, and so it's like it's a company that's been around for over a century doing this work. Like, yeah, you should I should have had a little bit more self-awareness and humility
But
around like
there's a nice broadening there where it's like, hey, maybe academia isn't the only source of where this, you know,
1,000%.
like
Yeah,
private companies are not incented to publish. They're not incented to talk about whatever their secret
totally.
sauce and things that they know is. That doesn't mean they don't know,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
And they
yeah.
know
No,
it's
it's
P
I
less than
remind
0.05 and it's peer reviewed. It's just the P less than 0.05 is because it makes us money, and the peer reviewed is, and it's been looked at by a lot of executives that have tried to kill it, and it keeps making us money, so we don't kill it.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, I do make this point often to behavioral scientists now when they are like kind of like ask about sort of like the shape of the field and size of the field from the applied side. And like, yeah, it's true. Like a lot of the um, you know, the organizations that typically are like more visible, unless like part of your mandate is thought leadership and like you're supposed to be producing stuff, but like even if that's what you're doing, that should hopefully just be kind of like the tip of the iceberg. Like you're really supposed to be doing the work and then maybe you're doing some thought leadership talking about it. The really the types of organizations that do it most are consultancies because like that's how they sell business, you know.
Right.
Like I lead a team now in-house somewhere. It's like we don't sell business outside of it, so we don't talk about like it that way.
Right.
So you get kind of a skewed view of it, I think, if you're just kind of like scrolling LinkedIn. I hope you're not scrolling LinkedIn. If you're scrolling LinkedIn, that's probably like you're getting a skewed view of it, you know?
Yes, 100%. I mean, perpetually someone will release like top five behavioral scientists thing on LinkedIn, and I'm like, well, they might be the people talking about it. I don't know though. I think those are the top five people doing it. They're probably the five best writers about it. But but on the flip side of that, I mean, you have also there's a version of that story that sounds like, well, you go into a hole and you sort of do your behavioral science and you don't participate in the field. But you have had, one foot in the public, whether
Yeah,
it's at sort of the MBBS program and sort of
yeah,
Penn's version of this
yeah,
and
yeah,
Bessie and sort of like how have you managed, you know, you can track how much bandwidth I have by how much I write, right? Like, when things get
yeah,
tough at work, it's the writing, my work is not the thing that suffers. It's,
yeah,
I'm not going to write about behavioral science this month because I'm trying to deal with whatever the hell's going on over here. I'm trying to do the
yeah,
work. How have you balanced that sort of like public, being a behavioral science executive, which I know you and I have talked about, and we're going to do a special episode on sort of the
yeah, yeah.
executive skills that make behavioral science executives
Hmm.
different and special. How have you sort of balanced those two requirements? I mean, I know you stepped away from being chairperson for Bessie, right?
Yeah,
Which indicates at least some movement. I mean, you also have youngin and family and other kind. You've got a lot of demands on your time. Talk a little bit about that. Sort of how do you navigate that space?
sure. Um, Yeah, I mean, I probably starting around the time when I was at Merits. Well, I guess even going back to like we were first asking like, oh, why did my friend recommend like going into consulting? Is like part of it was I think I was already just like working kind of a lot, you know. Like I was in school, but I was like kind of working three jobs while I was in school. I think I did something pretty similar when I was in undergrad as well. Um, so used to just sort of doing that, I think. And used to them being pretty disparate, you know. In undergrad, it's like I was a writing tutor and I delivered the newspaper and I did like a, I don't know, history consultant, if that's even a job, for like a local nonprofit. So anyways, um, I think when I was at Merits, I sort of more formally started thinking of it as like a portfolio of work that's more broad than just like, you know, what are you? I'm the director of innovation at Merits or whatever. So I would say like, well, I'm a behavioral scientist and I do a couple different things. And that's always like the lead in. Um, and so I've maintained this kind of balance of industry work, academic work, and then some kind of like philanthropic nonprofit work. Obviously, Bessie is kind of like the longest running, I guess, at this point.
Yeah,
So,
12, 12, more than 12 years, man.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's just, I think, because it's like, one, due to, I think, the generosity of Steve Wendell, the founder, who's just been like very generous with having kind of started it and then just like let people use it as a platform to do lots of things, right? So, um, that's something that we kind of have maintained to this day, but I think that's probably why I've spent so much time volunteering there. You also start to shift a little bit, or at least I've, shifted a little bit from like, you know, in the beginning for me that was useful because like I finally found a community that I, kind of was looking for. And then it was helpful because I was meeting people who, led to like a job for me. Now it's more of like, how can I do that for other people, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit more the orientation that I have towards it now. Um, the I started teaching at Penn while I was at Merits as well. And so that's again also has kind of like evolved over the years. So, at first it was like a pretty small course. It was capped at 20 students. Um, and it was like an applied consulting course basically. So they got to do a project with like a organization, NGO or a government team or a company or startup that had some kind of behavioral challenge or question. And then that has evolved over the years to, it's now like integrated into the capstone for the course. So it's like 150, 170 students. So the program has grown. The instruction has kind of evolved along with it. And then my role has kind of evolved too. So I always, somebody was asking me about this actually this week, like how do I think about those things? And I always kind of expect it to change a little bit. So there have been times when I was, you know, fully in industry, teaching a little bit, nonprofit a little bit, fully in academia, consulting a little bit in industry, um, and so I sort of kind of anticipate that to just be something that I kind of dial up and dial down, as like opportunity and interest and impact sort of change. Um, so the way that I kind of balance it, one is like, you know, I do spend a lot of time on it. So there's not like a one weird trick to get it all done in, 40 hours or something like that. I think that it is probably like in part due that, you know, um, my wife also has like lots of varied interests and, is active in lots of different things. And so it's not unusual for us to both be kind of just like working on our own little projects related to, she's a civil rights attorney. And so she's always got lots of things that she, could be helping out with or people are asking for help with. And so, um, we just kind of spend a lot of time doing those things that are of interest to us. Um, and then within that, though, I'll try to kind of always have a sense of, to what extent am I still enjoying it, and to what extent do I feel like it's having an impact? And if if I'm not enjoying it, but it's having an impact, I'll maybe do it a little bit more. But if it's not having an impact, like I'll pretty much stop immediately.
Okay.
Sometimes even if I'm kind of enjoying it. Um, but usually there's like a pretty tight alignment of those two things and what I'm doing. Um, so it changes, right? So like as you pointed out, I've had all of these different roles with Bessie over the years. So I led the DC chapter, and then I was president for a few years, and then I was a board member, and then I was a board chair. Scott Young is now our board chair. Shout out to Scott Young.
Woo.
That's the other secret is to sucker other people who are better than you into doing things so that you don't do them. A big thank you to Scott. So Scott's now the board chair. I'm still an active board member, but it is different. I mean, I didn't really I don't know that I could have appreciated it until like he stepped into the role and was doing such a good job immediately that I was like, oh, like. like a little bit of a weight kind of felt like it was off my, I mean, it's not like it was a burden or anything like that, but it was just like, oh, I don't have to dedicate this time and energy in the same way as before. And then really, I mean, simultaneously, like that shift happened December to January. At the same time, shifted into a new role with the MBDS program at Penn as the board chair for they have a board for their master's program. Um, so I can already tell that's going to basically take the time that I was putting towards Bessie, and so I'll kind of shift this a little bit. Um, but again, it's very like interesting, work that it's things that can see having a big impact. I mean, of course, part of it's like strategy for the program, but um, more broadly, how can we um, identify and sort of calcify more a broader set of career paths for early career behavioral scientists, um, and how can we like uh, find more opportunities for um, behavioral scientists to kind of get training on things, right? Sort of practical training on things. So there's like a lot of things that I think will be interesting and exciting there. So that's I kind of just sort of follow what seems to be most energizing a little bit too.
Well, we can't end the podcast without talking a little bit about your own growth, right?
Yep.
And really stepping into that. There comes a point where you just don't. Your daily life is not running project behavioral science projects. I mean, it's more being an executive, which I'm often asked sort of what's the difference. And I'm like, well, you spend a lot more time managing up, spend a lot more time finding the projects than doing the projects. You spend a lot more time with like hiring and the budget and the sort of all of the different parts of that.
Hmm.
How is that? Some people don't love that, right? Stepping away from the daily work feels like a giant loss for them.
Hmm. Yeah.
As you stepped into more of an executive role and you're not getting to be as close to the work as you once were, still, obviously, you're still close to the work. I know you are still care
Yeah. Yeah.
deeply about it, but you're not running the project anymore in
Yeah.
the same
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
you once were. How does that feel for you? How do you know if that's the right step for you? When did you get a sense that that might be the right thing for you? Are you even sure it's the right thing for you?
Yeah. No, I do think it is. I found it very rewarding. I mean, the way that that kind of came about. So yeah, so I lead this team for this wealth management firm here in the States, and the I had written, or I should say, I co-edited this book on how to build a behavioral science capability in an organization. Laurel Newman, who I mentioned earlier, was one of the was the co-editor, and then we had a bunch of authors who contributed chapters to it. Um, and essentially, it was like, hey, like where can you apply behavioral science in an organization? Like kind of at a functional level. And then a little bit on sort of like how would you structure it? Are there different ways of doing it? Should you have a big centralized team? Should you kind of embed it? Should you sort of a hybrid? How do you think about ethics in the work and things like that? How do you practical research, right? Um, so some of the leaders of this organization had seen that, and they already knew me, but they'd sort of seen that, and they were like, "Hey, like, could you come here and do that?" So really from the get-go, the mandate was to build a capability, not necessarily to go and like do a bunch of projects. So I think that was my orientation even coming in. Um, and I alluded to this earlier, but I mean, I am kind of on you know, sort of on the side of more like a systems-oriented type of person. So like, hey, how can we build this to, you know, be more durable and to help more people and all that. Um, so I mean, you're totally right though. Like I mean, like the nature of the work is different. I do, um, you know, weigh in, I would say regularly on like projects that are ongoing and things like that. But the ambition from the very beginning has been to build the best applied behavioral science team in the world. That was like the quote that I kind of was like, this is our North Star. And more than just kind of I don't know, ambitious statement. It is also, has implications for who you hire and how you position them and the nature of the work that they do and all of that. So, it's less of like you know, I mean, there's different models for behavioral science teams and functions that can all be successful. So there's a model where you have like, relatively junior folks that are sort of kind of doing a lot of volume of running a lot of tests of things and whatever. Um, And you may even have that in a big organization that's like a part of what you do, right? We didn't start with that. And instead we have like typically like very senior people. Like oftentimes they led a behavioral science team somewhere else or they published a book, so it's their I try to hire people that basically like could do my job at any time. And then they are the point person, for behavioral science for the function, in which they are embedded. Um, which an organization of our size, that might be like they'll have 2,000 colleagues that are in that area, right? I mean, so it's significant. And the nature of the work is pretty different. So, I do help out with kind of like, I've got a question about this, or what do you think about this approach? But it is not like I'm providing kind of, line by line oversight on, a project or something like that. Um, so it is asking a lot of those other people. I mean, they sort of like, they lead these things independently and they operate very independently. They, work with executives independently, scoping work, high impact work independently. So the nature of my work does shift. I mean, it aligns to some of the things that you said, right? Of kind of, you know, you're aligning things within the organization, you're working on sort of hiring and budgets and all that stuff. Um, I would say the other shift is that um, I will often serve in that capacity, kind of providing like a behavioral sort of expertise point of view at a more like enterprise level.
Hmm.
Um, so um, I find myself doing that kind of more and more as well. Um, so, yeah, it is like a little bit of once you start to manage a function, like there are just sort of a shared kind of core set of management things that you do. But within that, I think there is like, you know, think about like the variability that you can have in sort of a manager doing things. Like there are ways to do it better and there are ways to do it less good, right? And so you can bring behavioral science to that. But then also like you'll find that your peer set and, just really I think folks across the organization are like, oh, like they'll come to you and ask you for like help on their thing. So sometimes it's more of a fit for somebody else on our team, but sometimes it's something that I would do as well.
Yeah, that's sort of that internal advisory piece.
Hmm.
And I think to your point, you sort of talked about behavioral science team as its own intervention, right? So behavioral science teams run interventions on behalf of the business, but there is also, from a management perspective, the behavioral science team itself is an intervention into the
Yeah,
business,
yeah.
right? Try to change the behavior of the larger business in a variety of ways, and the behavioral science team is the way that you do that.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, there are, I have often found that folks are, interested in seeking that, especially like, depending on how you kind of show up. I mean, I think that like that is often the role that I play, but also like kind of my guidance to other folks that are leading behavioral science teams is like, understand the challenges that everybody else is working on. Like those are your challenges. You don't have separate behavioral science challenges and priorities and whatever. Like you have the priorities that other people have, and then how can you help them accomplish those things? And even with just that as like a starting point, I found that folks are typically very receptive. Um, Somebody asked the question. We had a Bescy panel a couple of weeks ago, and one of the kind of discussion points was like, kind of the brand of behavioral science or the perception of behavioral science, like do people want it or not? And my kind of point of view is like the brand is like very strong in the sense that like if you ask somebody like, do you need to better understand like why is somebody doing the thing that they're doing? Like, do you have some behavior that you think you need to change? Like the answer is always yes. And so, you know, if you're a good, if you want to be successful, I think in like building out a capability, like you have to understand really even before you ask them that question, like you should probably kind of know the know the answer and have a pretty good idea of like how, you can help them with that. So those are the like that is what I spend a lot of time doing, is that.
And what a great place to end it, right? Sort of, you know, taking on that executive, that sort of business, the problems of the business are your problems, right? And that version of a view, I think, uh, is a really, the sign of a matured behavioral science career when, you spend less time looking down into your projects and more time looking out into the business and
Yeah,
saying,
yeah. I
is
mean,
what
yeah,
it's
the
what it's
problems of this
about.
or the wonderful opportunities of the business are your wonderful opportunities.
That's right. They don't have any problems. We can put a more positive frame on them. Uh, well, Zarak, thanks so much for coming and sharing your story. I mean, I think that you've been, we're fortunate in that you have been a very publicly involved behavioral scientist, although I don't know that I think that public involvement hasn't always necessarily been about telling your story. And so I think having this opportunity to sort of walk through, like, hey, how did you get there? Especially since, there are folks who did go farther, got a PhD in social psychology, or,
Yeah.
went on a route that looked more traditional behavioral science. I think you've done a really good job of blazing that trail. I always laugh at, there's two very distinct generations of behavioral scientists that come on the show, right? And there's folks like you and me and Steph Habib and folks who didn't grow up in a world where behavioral science was like a term
Yeah.
people used. And then
Yeah.
there's people like Pete Judo who are like, my undergraduate degree is behavioral science, which in
Yeah.
some ways sort of blows your mind, right? I mean, if you think back to young Zarak in college, the history major,
Yeah.
like, would you have ever believed that there would
Yeah.
be
No, it's amazing.
programs for this?
I know. Yeah. I mean, I try to hold like both of these things kind of in my mind at the same time. One is like I am like I think it's amazing. And it's like it truly felt when I was like kind of when I wa first walked into this like action design room, it was like, oh, I finally found like the t other 10 people that do. Um And so like now and they're like, yeah, there are programs like this out there. There's like like, kind of channels that you can actually go through. So like I hold that in my mind, and then I also kind of still hold in my mind like, and it can still be better. Like there's so much opportunity. So yeah, no, I'm excited and excited for uh, you know, making it even better.
Awesome.